In this session, basically what I intend to do is to try and look at a media system analysis framework and provide a perspective on broadcasting in India then and now. I'll touch upon a few issues as it developed in our country. Broadcasting fits into the general framework of mass media, definitely, and its advantages and disadvantages, etc., are well documented. But what is important in mass media studies is not so much what I would say as obsession with advantages, characteristics, etc., which are very obvious for us to understand. Broadcasting in India has to be looked at from its evolution in the last part of the colonial framework. We are looking at the time frame of 1920s onwards. By that time, the dynamics of nationalistic fervor in India had gained considerable momentum. It would be interesting to note in the present context of debate, all the debates in the 80s and 90s where there was concern about commercial broadcasting, etc. But what is not known in terms of discussion is that broadcasting in India actually started as an enterprise by a few enthusiasts who through the radio clubs launched stations in Kolkata, Mumbai and Chennai. Interesting to note that the British administration wanted to evolve broadcasting in commercial mode, where it would charge the radio stations license fees, and for the broadcast receiver licenses they would charge an annual license fee. And like any other technology, this technology had to be imported completely from wherever they were developing, by and large in Britain and United States, and they had a customs duty component, which they thought together would be able to not only give them revenue, but also sustain the broadcasting stations. Unfortunately, this system fell flat with the then Indian Broadcasting Company being forced into liquidation, and there was a dilemma. The dilemma was twofold. One is take the route and close down the stations and call it so be it. The other one was to continue. Now, it's very interesting in the continuation philosophy that the British administration had. There was a lot of concern about the benefit they wanted to give to the British radio manufacturer companies, and they were a considerable lobby. So ultimately, the lobby, as one of the pressure groups, seemed to have won, and broadcasting became a unit of the government of India, and it became subsequently an advantage to the post-independent administrative setup, that the foundation of how to run or how to control broadcasting through the state was very well established as early as 1935, and got consolidated during the war years, and further reinforced through the setup of information and broadcasting, which was mainly aimed at promoting the British point of view in the war efforts. So when the transfer of power took place, the broadcasting setup got transferred as a government department, and the Britishers had not invested substantially in the expansion of broadcasting for their own reasons. Many people attribute motives, and some scholars have even said that being an oral medium of communication, its impact would have been far more intense than the print medium, and probably would have contributed to the cause of nationalism more intensely than what print could do, because print was obviously limited by the literacy factor, which was very low, and also the heavy license fee, heavy in relation to the affordability of the majority of the Indians, had restricted the broadcasting to few European officials and business interests and the elite. So broadcasting in the colonial construct is a fascinating study of cultural practices. There are also references to the fact that a few philanthropists and people inclined with altruistic motives had even set up village broadcasting sets to loudspeakers, etc., etc. So that is one aspect as to how India inherited a state administered broadcasting system. And for those of us who would like to attribute motives, we may exercise some degree of caution, because broadcasting from the 1920s up to 1947 grew and got consolidated as a government setup. Now, post-independence, as all of you know, that we adopted a planning philosophy based on whichever model you think, a centralized planning model like the erstwhile Soviet Union. But what it essentially did was to look at priorities and allocation of resources. So in the first 5-year plan, the notion that broadcasting is a potential information multiplier, which many have argued in different kinds of literature, was no doubt a compelling reason, but the infrastructure needed a lot of capital resources, because broadcasting was a government setup. So, the initial allocation for broadcasting was definitely not commensurate with whatever its advantages were in terms of there is of course a larger debate which is valid even today, as many of you know, is what does the medium actually do? I mean, whose information does it carry? And this is a recurring question that we all have asked. It does not matter whether it is radio or new media, as long as the control of content, the control of thinking, the control of thought process is embedded in media, then the nature of that control is also very important. So, the first Minister of Information and Broadcasting, and they were, had to look at how broadcasting could be sustained and developed further. In a large country like ours, competing demands, and also interesting to note that many of the princely states have also had broadcasting, but very interesting when you look at the documents, some of the references definitely will be supplemented as we go along. All had to be regulated within the framework of the much criticized Indian Telegraph Act. Broadcasting came under the provisions of the Telegraph Act then, and even now, even as late as last month, the Indian Telegraph Act has been invoked to make changes in terms of policies, regulation, etc. So, the Act, despite all the amendments, the core philosophy of the Act stays. So, media system in broadcasting or definitely looks at a framework. Now, you might ask me, why is it so important that broadcasting has existed in different parts of the world or continues to exist in some form of a state intervention? The answer is obvious, because broadcasting uses spectrum, and spectrum is a limited resource. It is limited because if more people use the same spectrum at the same time, it can also always lead to what we call as atmospheric chaos. And therefore, all over the world, broadcasting, spectrum are all factors which are regulated, if not controlled. One has to understand the difference between regulation and control. Regulation is normally done to protect the best interests of the consumer. Control is normally invoked because the governance system would like to have its say over what is broadcast and what is not broadcast. So, many a time we tend to confuse and use the words interchangeably, but probably as teachers we may appreciate the difference, subtle of course, that is there between regulation and control. Post broadcasting, at least in the 2 or 3 5-year plans, broadcasting was subsumed under the broad area of communications, where post, telegraphs, roads, and also a category called broadcasting. But then broadcasting became more and more important. It got a separate label, although under the broad framework of communications, and resources were allocated for its expansion. But the impetus for expansion in the broadcasting sector are both a result of enthusiasm based on the belief that mass media and development are, what should I say, symbiotically connected, but also the need for the government, because you will recall that 60s was a challenging period for the government of India. We had external crisis on our borders, and the policies of the government could not be translated effectively to get the kind of moral support and appreciation that we were trying to address some of the issues. So broadcasting also was a tool of foreign policy. If you look at the famous Voice of America episode, where you would recall that a decision was given to allot a high profile transmitter on a very token price of ₹1. I mean, there are references which will be put up on this whole episode. What it meant was that it tried to impress to the government of India that what is lacking is the communication infrastructure to reach out to the people. So concurrently with this kind of a crisis, there was also a parallel development that was taking place. And the parallel development is another major area of intervention, which I am sure that some of the other resource persons will touch upon, is the relationship to development, what we call as communication and development paradigm. Now, this communication and paradigm development brought in a new element of another sensory experience, that of television. Now, those of you who I am sure that deal with communication and development would recall that the planning for the world's most famous and almost a textbook case of use of communication for development happened in India in the 1975 to 76 framework, what is often called as the satellite instructional television experiment, SITE. Now, the experiment as such is one aspect which probably will come back to it, or I am sure that there will be references to it as part of your inputs by other speakers as well. But what it did was it was a showcase. It was a showcase of demonstration of one of the most advanced communication technologies at that point of time. Now, here it is important to see that India has never been deficient in terms of absorption of communication technology. Print media, you may recall, came to India by accident in less than about 75 to 80 years after its so-called invention in Germany. But broadcasting is definitely a product of, broadcasting as a means of reaching out to large section of population. Radio, of course, is a technology that predates this broadcasting application, because it was intended for shore to sea communication. So radio propagation and things like that are very crucial, and they have their history of their own. But mass media applications where scholars are interested in radio broadcasting would definitely put the date around mid-1920s, and India had the benefit of broadcasting as early as 1922. So here was a case of one of the most advanced communication technologies at that point in time, and even now, if you look at the Indian National Space Program, for example, it is one of the most frontier programs in the world. So, the arrival of satellite in India gave boost to the advocacy for television and also a demonstration of satellite technology for a large country like India. Why is it demonstration? Because India had never invested in terrestrial technology for broadcasting. So, there had to be a whole philosophy of belief in science. So, building up of scientific institutions in space is also strongly linked to broadcasting sector. We may make deep references to that, but that's not my idea. The idea is that the promoter of the space program or the founder of the space program, as many would recall, Vikram Sarabhai had this vision that there's no point in harnessing new technologies if it doesn't benefit a large number of people. So, satellite technology is a transmission medium, television as a medium of communication, all were concurrently running while radio was being developed in response to the crisis situation that I mentioned earlier. So, All India Radio, which was the governance structure for a very long time in broadcasting, which predates, the name predates independence, and people like Fielden in their autobiography also have given references as to how the name All India Radio came about. So, this is something that All India Radio was developing its own master plan of expansion of broadcasting, and it also felt that it had a natural and an extended and an obvious interest in television. So, for a very long time you had All India Radio, which also had television under its wing, and then institutional separation came about, which is a different kind of a analytical framework. So, while the master plan was incremental, satellite was considered as leapfrogging. So, the leapfrogging arguments won the political and the scientific community of the day, and we had satellite experiment, as I said, and that got translated into advocacy of the Indian National Satellite System. And today, recently, you also have, the latest communication satellite that has been launched by ISRO, which is dedicated to Air Force and surveillance. So, the continuity of communication technologies for a host of users is something that India has sustained, irrespective of any other changes that have come about. So, when you had radio and television interest, incidentally, history books also tell us that television was by way of an accident, they say. But in industrial economies, accidents don't occur as people make it out to be. It's a carefully constructed. So, Philips company in an industrial fair had put up a television transmitter, and found it extremely difficult to, not extremely difficult, probably not non-viable to take it back so that you can use it, but they had a price for it. And international collaboration, funding, foundation philosophy, everything came together and said that a developed country like India should have television, and what better way if you can set up an experimental service. And that's how you had the Delhi experimental service started in 1959. And the history thereafter is also very well documented, and many of you might be using it in your classrooms in terms of your own approach to the subject. So, while broadcasting grew, and as I said, it already had established itself under the Government of India structure, voices and murmurs begin to appear that, was this a voice of the establishment? See, broadcasting as a voice of establishment, irrespective of who the establishment, was a major concern. And this is where we have to differentiate between access to a media and the information it generates. See, in entertainment, music and other programs, it no doubt has a sense of neutrality about it. But even in music, we have had debates of promotion of classical music versus film music. That there's a whole literature about it. But particularly in the news, India, of course, has adopted democracy with utmost belief in it. So when you're balancing news output in a broadcasting medium, how do you balance the news bulletin? Very interesting way of looking at news bulletins, the way they are constructed in the 15-minute, I'm talking about the prime time news bulletin in All India Radio for a very long time was the 9 p.m. news bulletin, preceded by the Hindi or the English one. And this was a, act of balancing, decreasing order of importance or ascending order of importance. You have to have sports, you have to have culture, you have to have political parties, etc. So some of the old All India Radio news analysis do talk about whether the government of the day was overwhelmingly interested in not giving enough representative, space to the opposition party. So, when we talk about committees and commissions in broadcasting, always the committees are concerned with, degree and nature of control. Be it the Chanda committee or be it many committees later, they've always talked about control and autonomy. So, we also have to look at the philosophy of the political leadership. For example, if you're talking about the first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and his approach to freedom, at least in various records, it's very clear that he believed in freedom, and he also believed in an autonomous broadcasting organization like the BBC, or so his pronouncements have been. But when committees started looking at it, they said that the only way broadcasting can be a balanced and representative is to have a degree of autonomy from the government. See, autonomy doesn't come without a price. Now, who is to run a broadcasting? You have policies and practices that it should not be too commercial. You have practices which say that the burden should not be transferred to the consumer with a hefty license fee. You remember that I had mentioned that license fee was perceived as one of the probable sources of revenue, and that system had continued for radio and also for television in India for a long time. But then it was felt that a medium like radio or television is better off without a license fee, so that there could be more uh, users, listeners, and viewers. Now, the alternative is that the government of the day makes a huge allocation and creates a structure that uh, functions in an autonomous manner and insulates it from the political control, as it is often alleged by whoever is in the opposition at any given point in time. So, the argument for commercial or advertising as a source of broadcasting was also resisted in India for a very long time, and many of you know that only when we had a competing model like the Sri Lankan Broadcasting Corporation, which capitalized on making film songs a popular genre, and it had offices in India for advertising purposes. So, the introduction of commercial was considered by the government as a source of revenue, and how much of that revenue could actually make broadcasting completely autonomous is a debatable question, because you have to look at organization structure, the salary structure, etc. And even now, the issue of overstaffing in Prasar Bharati, for example, is being debated, and committees have been appointed to look at how it can be streamlined. So, did broadcasting inherit a large structure disproportionate to its functions, and therefore has become technically unwieldy, is another question that we may have to keep in mind. But nevertheless, the transition of All India Radio and its experimental supervision over television, issues of autonomy, etc., all combined together as a set of a, what should I say, an atmosphere where organizational changes and organizational reforms became imperative. And one of the imperative decisions probably was to try and separate, and which they did, that radio would be separate and television would be separate. Thus you have Doordarshan and Akashvani as two separate entities now, all governed under the probably diluted version of Varghese Committee recommendations on autonomous organization, and now you have Prasar Bharati. And since the setting up of Prasar Bharati, there has not been a satisfactory, what should I say, or a complementary kind of a appraisal as to whether Prasar Bharati as an autonomous organization has really lived up to the critique on the basis of which it was formed in the first place. Now, we need to look at other changes in the economy. Very often we make a mistake of looking at sectors, what I would say as a sectoral approach. But a sectoral approach, while it allows for intense focus, sometimes ignores the larger macro changes that are necessary or are announced. One of the important factors that all of us deal with in many other aspects of society, not only in India but the world over, is the so-called structural adjustment economic reforms, a consequence of which is globalization. And globalization, is a process by which many institutional aspects are affected, and one of that is naturally the field of communication and media. So post 1990s, when the liberalization argument was building up and there was a freeing up of the market in many sectors, one, it meant that the opportunities for broadcasting in terms of expansion, because broadcasting could easily accommodate itself in terms of the advertising needs of the number of companies and number of sectors which were freed up. So there was one incentive that broadcasting could be a means by which commercial revenue base could be enlarged. It also meant that the private sector participation in broadcasting was beginning to be, what should I say, articulated and also felt. So on the one hand, you had a critique of the governmental structure, justified or not is a different matter. And on the other, you had opening up, and like many other sectors, broadcasting sector also was on the anvil with regard to the reforms that was to be initiated. So developments in terms of for example satellite television, and which were fueled by satellite news, global news, of which you have many other issues. All this, what should I say, kind of became combination factors for establishment of initially unregulated, means basically in terms of distribution of signals from broadcasters in and around the world, and unregulated because it was through cable services, actually through door-to-door cabling, that channels beyond Doordarshan, etc., were made available, and there is a what should I say, cultural and technical history of how the cable wallas had wired up the cities and towns in India to make broadcasting available in multiple options. So this is something that we have got to recognize and there is uh, an articulation that it was the enterprise of the completely unregulated cable industry that made options for broadcasting, at least from the point of view of the viewer, better and varied. Now, along with this, you had discussions on content, on impact of content with regard to culture. There were concerns about the born out of cultural imperialism thesis, um, as to whether we were being bombarded with Western content, reruns, etc., etc. Now, this is something that formulated a viewing matrix as far as India is concerned. And as far as the television main broadcasting content is concerned, an organization like Doordarshan started with outsourcing its news capsules, particularly news from all over the world, to different agencies, and you had capsule programs, weekly capsule programs, which were being anchored and produced by agencies, and which later on became independent channels with their own following and with their own reputation. So the arrival of television probably was in a arrival or growth of television was in a far more what should I say, unregulated space, and the reasons for example, there was a lot of debate about transition from black and white television to color television, and Asiad became a Asiad in 1982, 83, 81, 82 became a spectacle which justified the introduction of color television. So the unregulated entry of content distribution, the multiplicity of news channels from across the world, what we call as the global news broadcasting channels, heralded the consolidation of satellite television in India in a very big way. I would still call them satellite television, because even if cable is the mode of distribution, it's the last mile distribution we are talking about, but ultimately the signals have to emanate from satellite position in India or elsewhere. So parallel to the growth of television, there were also concerns about certain what should I say, domestic or India specific concerns with regard to the spread of television in India. Cultural and political theorists such as Anand Mitra and others have talked about epics as contributing to political consolidation of one kind. So television is part of a very strong both cultural studies and mass media discourse in India, and you would see more and more people talking about expansion of television in terms of companies that are behind them, the huge soap operas that are being produced, the cereals that people are consuming. So there is a, a, a lot of analysis that goes on with regard to not only the spread of television but also the consumption of content in television. You we have to recognize that the vastness of the country and the sheer population that we have allows for the economies of scale to function. When I say economies of scale to function, um, people say that we have uh, you know space for many channels. Right now, the ministry informs us there are more than 800 channels. And interesting that out of the more than 800 channels, 400 to 410 channels are all in the news and current affairs. So news and current affairs comes back to square one in the sense that the political nature of news and current affairs, which was a highly critiqued subject matter when the government of India through All India Radio had access to the infrastructure. Now, the private television channels are also, being critiqued with regard to agenda setting functions, with regard to their vulnerability in terms of big political parties and economic groups. So the debate on news and current affairs, that is why as a perceptive development communicator like Kiran Karnik said, are we looking at poverty amidst plenty? What he was referring to is the mushrooming of television channels does not necessarily mean that there is plurality. Even we had the famous P.C. Joshi committee on software in television. All of them are have or are or have argued that television content and its consequences, etc., have to be understood